friction might be more effective than fear. Fear requires the awareness of censorship, and therefore it could be a signal of government weakness. If the government has to censor something, that means they're trying to hide something, right? It could undermine government legitimacy if people who are viewing censorship or object to censorship. And it could also ironically signal a topic's importance. So if I see that something is censored, I'm like, oh, this is really a great thing to write about. I'm going to write about it again, right? It's hard. It's also, as in the age of the internet, when sort of millions of people are creating information, it's really hard to make everyone believe in these government reprimands. It's really hard to intimidate millions of people instead of just a few, right? And small frictions have been shown in market research to slow down users. So for example, Google has shown that if it takes like a microsecond longer for that YouTube video to load, you're going to switch and look at another video because you're just really impatient. So why wouldn't this also be true in politics? Why wouldn't small costs of information also have big effects on users in politics? So I'm going to use 3 tests to understand how fear and friction are affecting typical internet users in China. The first, I'm going to compare bloggers who wrote identical posts, but one was censored and one wasn't censored. So this is sort of like a censorship mistake. There's 2 very identical posts in the same time period, and one just happens to be censored and one not. And I'm going to see how these bloggers reacted to that censorship. And what I'm going to find is that bloggers talk about more sensitive political topics after being censored in comparison to the control group. And this is evidence against the fear mechanism. The second, I'm going to do an experimental study of self-censorship of consumers of blog posts in Beijing. I'm going to find that people who observe censorship, that it piques their interest in that topic, they go searching for more information about that censored topic. And this is, again, evidence against the fear mechanism. I'm also going to find that observing censorship does not affect the citizens in my experiment who don't think that their error page was due to censorship. So for citizens who thought that the error page was because of an internet error, they're not affected by censorship. And this is evidence for the friction mechanism. And the last study I'm going to show is a study of the spread of information about self-immolation events in Tibet. And I'm going to find that there's a bigger spread of information when censorship is just a little bit slower. So I'm going to use the schedules of the censors to see when censorship is just a little bit slower, there's more information online about these self-immolation events. So the setup here is I have 593 bloggers from Baidu.com. I have the information about what they blogged about before censorship. So these blog posts were downloaded immediately after they were written. I have this over a 6-month period from the end of 2011 to the beginning of 2012. I returned to each blog post to see if it was later censored. So I have the timeline of these bloggers and when these individuals were censored. I have about 40,000 blog posts in total. And what I do for the analysis is I find instances, I use this algorithm for text matching. I find instances where they're identical or almost identical blog posts written by 2 different bloggers, but one of them was censored and one of them wasn't. Okay, so the censors essentially made a mistake on these 2 blog posts. And I also match on other important covariates. So I also make sure that these 2 bloggers are similar, that they have blogged about similarly sensitive topics in the past, that they're written at the same date, they have a similar censorship history, they have similar post-writing history. And I ask, how does the censored blogger versus the uncensored blogger, what do they write afterwards? How do they write differently afterwards? Okay? And what I find is that the blogger who is censored reacts with more defiance of the blogger that just happened not to be censored. So that I measure the similarity of the post after censorship to the censored post itself. And the blogger who is censored is more likely, so this is the difference between the treated and controlled, the censored versus uncensored, the blogger who is censored is more likely to write about a similar topic than the not-censored blogger. They're more likely to repeat what they already wrote. They're also more likely to write about sensitive topics than the uncensored blogger after censorship. And they're also more likely to get censored after censorship, okay? None of these differences, none of these effects are different before the censorship happens. So these are the same between treated and controlled before censorship happens, but they shift after censorship happens. They're also more likely to talk about political topics after censorship. So these are the topics, I have about 200 topics that I use to do matching in this case. These are the topics that are most different between treated and controlled after censorship. And the censored bloggers are more likely to talk about topics like Boshilai, about CCP history, about CCP officials and unrest after censorship than the control bloggers. The control bloggers moved on to other topics, of life topics. They move on to things like cooking, Chinese medicine, and they also sometimes talk more about politics, but they're much more likely to talk about life topics than the censored bloggers. Okay, so experiment 2. So in this experiment I conducted in the summer of 2013 in China, I gave participants a computer which was open to a list of blogs, so a blog aggregator. And only the title of the blog was on the page. They were given 5 minutes to read what interests them. They couldn't possibly read all of the blogs on the blog aggregator in 5 minutes, so they had to choose. And they were told they would be asked some questions afterwards. And I installed some software so I tracked exactly what they looked at during those 5 minutes. So the treatment was for a randomly selected topic for a subset of the participants. It would link to a censored error page. So instead of actually getting the blog post itself when they clicked on the link, they would get this page, which is what comes up for people when a blog post is censored in China. It says, we're sorry, the page you wanted to access does not exist or has been deleted. Okay? And the question was, how does the error page affect what the reader reads next? Do they read a post from the same topic, or do they switch to a different topic? And I also asked each participant afterwards what they thought the error page represented. Did they think it was an internet error? Did they think that it was purposefully deleted because of censorship? So the treated users were much more likely to click on the same topic than the control. So if you saw the censored error page, you're much more likely to go searching for more information on that topic than the control. But this effect was only large and significant for those who thought that the error page represented censorship instead of an internet error. Okay? So this is the difference of the probability of clicking on the same topic between treated and control. It's 0.32 and it's significant. For people who thought that the post was deleted, that it was censorship, it's 0.33. For people who thought that this was an internet error, the effect is much smaller and insignificant. I also asked people what they thought about censorship after the experiment. And treated users had a much lower view of political censorship than control users. And this is only true for those who recognize the treatment as censorship. So people thought that censorship should be much lower if they were treated than if they were controlled. And this is only true for people who thought that the post was deleted was censored. And not true for those who thought that the post was just an internet error. Okay, so the third test is on friction and self-immolations. So between 2011 and 2013, 120 Tibetans self-immolated in China. These are protests typically against the Chinese government. These events are extremely sensitive in China. They're uniformly censored. They're very, very off limits to talk about. So the setup was I took a sample of blogs related to these self-immolation events before censorship. And I'm assuming here that fear is constant across the events. No matter what the event is, these are all off-limits topics, all 120 of these. So what I noticed is that there's large variation in the amount of talk about these self-immolation events for each of these events. So on each of these red lines is the number of blog posts in the sample about each of the 120 events. So you can see some events get a lot of attention online, and some events get very, very little attention. Okay? So large variation in the amount of discussion about any of these 120 self-immolation events. I gathered as much information as possible about each of these events. So I was like, what could explain the difference in the variation about how much these were talked about between each of the events? I gathered whether the protester was a monk, the gender, the age of the protester, sometimes younger protesters, there's like a lot more sadness about the event, the time of day, or the day of the week. Nothing explained the difference. I ran a whole bunch of regressions on this. Nothing explained the difference except for whether the post was written on a weekend, whether the event happened on a weekend. Okay? And what I realized is from previous research that we've done, I realized that censorship in our data was actually faster on weekdays and slower on weekends. So that the censors were just a little bit slower to react to censorship on the weekends. And this is consistent with other studies on censorship in China, that the censors are kind of, working more during the week than on the weekend. So self-immolations are equally likely to happen any day of the week. It's uniform across the week. But if the friction hypothesis were true, then blogs would stay up slightly longer on weekends, so there'd be more discussion of self-immolation on weekends than during the week. So essentially, what I think is happening here is that Because the censors are a little slower on the weekends, there's just more discussion of them, and this has support for the friction hypothesis. So this paper tests the mechanisms behind censorship. How does censorship affect the spread of information? It finds that friction is more effective than fear at stalling the spread of information among typical bloggers in China. It uses 3 unique data sets, experimental and observational, and new techniques to measure censorship. So why would information friction be more effective than fear? Well, basically, friction is information control without the awareness of interference. If the awareness of interference undermines the government, then friction itself is a way of increasing the cost of information without making people aware of it. And this has lots of implications. So we've noticed in the Chinese government policy has switched more towards censorship methods of the internet that create less awareness. This also could explain variation in censorship tools across governments. Governments with more money to do censorship can also make their censorship less visible. And it could explain authoritarian resilience in the information age. So thanks very much. Looking forward to your questions.